Read Show. I'm your host, Joanna from Joanna Reads, and I apologize for the slight delay going live here. I was having a little bit of an echo and couldn't quite figure out how to resolve it. So I hope that doesn't come out to those of you who are watching. And I'm excited today to welcome two wonderful guests. Actually, I'm going to put myself on the bottom because I always feel more comfortable as the host on the bottom here. But I have two wonderful guests here with me that I'm so excited to talk to. And so one of those guests here with me today is Joseph Reads Books. I think I put your name incorrectly into the title of this video, Joseph. So I apologize about that, but I'll go ahead and fix that. Yes, so we have Joseph Reads Books here with us today. If you're a fan of Glenn Cook, then you've got to check out Joseph's channel. And then we also have the wonderful, lovely, nerdy Kathi, who I've been so excited to talk with for a long time too. So two wonderful channels that actually I discovered both channels, I think last year, I want to say maybe, or maybe towards the end of the year prior. And I've been a huge fan. So we always start this particular discussion series with the why read question. So without further ado, Joseph Reads Books. Why read?
I guess it's just escapism more than anything is why I read. I have always used books as a way to kind of get away since I guess junior high. So more than anything, escapism.
Escapism. And so when you say escapism, usually that could be escape from a situation, or like Tolkien explains this in his essay on fairy stories, or is it an escape to?
An escape too. Yeah, most of the time. I have some books that I read that are just like a way to escape from like just being stressed out and stuff, but mostly it's an escape too, just to explore places I'll never get to go.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, especially with some of the books you read, as they are, I think, on the darker side, I would say. I mean, I don't know. I've never read Glenn Cook, but I hear that his fantasy tends to explore some pretty dark themes, or that it's
Yeah.
military based. So a lot of war. Yeah.
Yeah, his stuff's pretty dark. I mean, even his epic fantasy series is much darker than you would expect from an epic fantasy series. It's the Dread Empire series that almost no one has read.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure you have though, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, we're gonna have to get into this more in this discussion because actually, Joseph, I knew I wanted to have on Why Read for a long time, and then Kathi, I knew I wanted to have on Why Read, and then I was trying to think of the pairing, and it just came to me in the middle of the night. Oh, they both read Glenn Cook. Now, I have not read Glenn Cook, but I was thinking that would be kind of a fun conversation to have on this discussion. Why read Glenn Cook? Why Glenn Cook cooks, as I think you say on your channel, Joseph.
Yeah.
So we'll get into the why read Glenn Cook part of this a little bit later. But Kathi, why read?
Why do I read? The short answer, very short answer, is because I have read since I was a child, like every day since I was very young. The longer answer is because I love learning. Even now, it doesn't matter how old I get, I'm always looking to learn new things. And I love learning about cultures and other races and philosophy, politics, history. I think it helps me then learn about myself. It helps me broaden my mind and walk in someone else's shoes, that someone else's experience that I might never know about because I will never have an opportunity to meet that person. And it also allows me to travel to far distant galaxies or to strange, bizarre new worlds, which I can't do anywhere else. It's one of the most satisfying things that I've ever done. And I think I can't imagine not reading. It's just always been a large part of my life. So that's why I read anyway.
Yeah, those are wonderful reasons. And I do feel this, especially the experiencing other cultures, other races, other types of ways of life. And I do wonder if that is something that related to Joseph's answer on escapism, if and escaping too, if that's something that we as people who love fantasy specifically, I mean, I know that the three of us also read other genres as well. If that's something very specific to that genre that we all gravitate towards. The fact
Probably.
that we are exploring something so much more expansive than our own cultures or lives.
Well, our perspective is really quite narrow. It is only our lives that we have experienced, whereas we get to experience so many other perspectives and lives that otherwise we will never learn about. And I think that is how you help broaden your experience. And it also helps you decide, do I have any biases or preconceptions that I need to reevaluate given all these new experiences that I'm reading about? So, yeah, I think though escapism is a great reason
Yeah.
as well, because that's what it is. Fantasy truly is escapism, but I also think it has a lot of stories to tell us, a lot of principles it can teach us, because ultimately fantasy still is about people. Yeah,
Yes.
whatever the setting. Yeah,
Yeah. I think, and honestly, back to the escapism part, I think both sides of those equation can be valid too. I know, Joseph, you said you have certain fantasy books that you like to escape to when life is hard. Because, I mean, as Mitch says here, that, some of us, we, at times in life, we do have intrusive thoughts and feelings. We have
yeah,
challenging situations that we're in, or the politics or that are going on and the newsreel is just so disconcerting that
yeah,
it feels like getting away from that for some time is always a good thing. And then at the same time, escaping too, as I think Tolkien tries to make this point, like I said, I feel like there's something that can expand us out. There's something expansive and wondrous and exciting about
yeah,
exploring and just deep diving into either the psychology of different characters or the constructions of other worlds. Um, so many wonderful ways that we can explore books. I have a question
exactly.
here from the Fantasy Network from my friend Jimmy here. He says, "Joseph, what is your favorite perk in Black Drop Sticks? What
Black
is
Ops
that?"
6. It's a Call of Duty video game, and probably Quartermaster because you get to regenerate your grenades over time.
Nice. And I want to shout out here, Magneno Alex. Thank you so much for the $5. The very kind of you, and epic to see you here in the Y Read chat. So yeah, very based of you, Joseph. So yeah, so from here we should go ahead and go into some Glenn Cook here. So Glenn Cook is the author I want to read next, says Capricious Fox here, and I want to ask you all, what is the deal with Glenn Cook? Why should we read Glenn Cook?
I've only read 2 books, I should mention, so far in the Black Company series. Joseph has read everything I think that Glenn Cook has read, because I think you've brought out a video doing a deep dive on Glenn Cook. Is that
Yeah,
right? That
yeah.
seems to be my recollection. I haven't watched it because I want to read a bit more of him before I do.
I tier ranked everything he's written,
Mm,
and so when it comes to why read Glenn Cook, one of the major reasons with the Black Company especially is because as much as grimdark is misused as a term now, he
Yes.
really is like the creator of it. It started with him, even though it's funny in an interview he was talking about I'd never heard of grimdark until someone told me I wrote grimdark. I just thought I was writing fantasy novels, and so the Black Company is just such a good place to start with that. He was such a huge inspiration for Steven Erikson. So anyone who loves Malazan should check it out. I mean, the Black Company is definitely where
me?
the Marines came from. And
Yeah.
even with other stuff that Glenn Cook has written, he has in the Dread Empire series, a major part of it takes place in the desert, and it is so much like the Seven Cities that it's unreal.
Have you
And
read
so,
Molassin, Joseph? I didn't know
yeah,
if you had.
yeah, I've read them all.
Oh, okay. All the Molassin books, like all
No,
of them,
not
or
the
just
not the
the 10
Esselmont,
book series?
just the Books of the Fallen. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. Okay, cool.
Isn't Deadhouse Ghost your favorite?
Yes, that one is my favorite.
That's what I
So
thought.
I thought
Yeah.
this would be a good opportunity, by the way, because just yesterday, and I have not opened it yet, I got my broken binding editions
Oh,
of
Nice.
the book.
yay.
So I'm going
So
to go
did
ahead.
I.
and open them here. Well, I saw that. I
Instantly.
saw that you got them. So I'm
Oh,
actually
look,
opening them here while on Why Read.
wonderful.
If I can get this thing open. Sorry, I can't share the camera angle. I'm not really fancy with the camera angle like the Fantasy Network is. But let's see if I can do this. So these are the first. Sorry for the sound effects too. I should probably mute my mic, but I'm not going to do that. Very unprofessional here today.
No, I love it actually. I know how
Whoa.
excited I was. I got them yesterday. I only got them yesterday. So, yeah.
Broken binding does not disappoint when it comes to these things. Look at their beautifully wrapped, and I love their black
Yeah.
ribbons. So first book here. Let's see if I can get this out. I have a very little workspace here, a little table here. So
I'm actually in my study. But it's
this
like
is so
2 a.m.
fun.
here.
2 a.m. Oh my gosh.
2 a.m. Yeah, 2 a.m. Well, that's the thing with time zones, right? I'm in Australia. So, what about for you, Joseph? What's the date?
The date? It's the 15th. It's 10 a.m.
No,
for
the
me.
state. What state
Oh,
do
I'm
you
in
live
Texas. Sorry.
Ah,
We got Gardens
oh,
of the
look
Moon
at
here.
that. Oh,
I know
they're
everybody's
so
already
gorgeous.
gotten these, but so I'm like, I feel like I'm the last one, but I don't mind. And I'm gonna guess
I,
this is Memories of Ice by the size of it.
yeah,
I
you
read the
can
mass
tell,
market
can't you?
paperback of this.
Yeah,
Aha! Memories of Ice.
that
Gorgeous.
one's.
Wow, that spine is ridiculous. That's amazing.
Put them together. Put them together.
Let me get the third one out first, really quickly. The favorite of you two. So the third one here. I've never done a live unboxing before, I don't think. Well, maybe once.
That's fine.
Dead House Gates. It's your favorite. Wow.
I love that book.
Whoa. That is
It
an
is
incredible cover.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Look at
It's
that. That's so neat.
yeah.
So these are absolutely stunning. I wish I could hold all of them up at the same time.
They're
See.
heavy.
They are
Yeah.
a bit heavy.
They're really heavy.
They're backwards, but they're kind of right here. Yay.
Gorgeous.
So hooray. Hooray for some Malazan books here. And
That's something we all love, isn't it? Equally. I think
yeah.
it's one of your favorites as well, Joanna.
Yes, it is. Yeah. It is
Yeah.
I love this series. It's very close to my heart. I read it the first year that I started a channel, actually. I had read the first 3 books prior to starting a channel, and then the first year I started a channel, most of the time was dedicated to finishing this series. It was my main priority. But
Yeah.
so my earliest reviews on this channel are Malazan reviews, and they're very poor quality, but I'm so proud of them. I'm so proud of them.
You should be.
Yeah. I mean, they have a very special place in my heart. I feel like Malazan broke open the floodgate of emotion for me. And it's been just so beautiful to watch your journey, Kathi, through the series, and just how thorough you are. You're so thorough in discussing the books and describing why it's so meaningful to you and describing it in an emotional and connected way, which I think is very difficult to do all the above. So
Thank you. Honestly, I just feel so much when I'm reading them because they have had an enormous impact. I was surprised to find a series that I could love as much as I love this series. So I just want to talk about it all the time. And I think that says everything. If you are that passionate about a series of books, then they've touched you in a way that other series haven't. So it's a very special series, and I'm very close to finishing now. I have 3 more left. So
yes, I heard that.
soon.
I heard that.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
Joseph, what about your Malazan journey? So did you start that? Did you read those before you started a channel, or are
Yeah,
those?
I read them back in 2020 and I binged them in like 5 months. That's all I did for 5 months, and I did them all on audio of all things.
Oh, wow.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah.
That's impressive. So you're really good with audiobook listening skills is what I take it.
Yeah, I mean, I've been listening to audiobooks, not exclusively. It's just I happen to have been lucky enough to listen to them at work when I first got into them, and since I don't know 2008, something like that. So I've been a long audiobook enjoyer.
That's impressive. I know Michael Cronk, the book guy, he also listened to them via audio and seems to have absorbed them extraordinarily well. I'm so impressed with people who can do that. I read physically or visually the first three books, and then for books 4 through 10, I did immersion read them. But and then sometimes I just visually read. I would take breaks from the audiobook and just visually read. But there were times when I was reading through the series that I tried just listening without seeing the words in front of me, and I could not absorb it. I could not absorb I could not process what I was listening to. Like I kept on over and over and over again, trying to repeat the prologue of one of the books, and it was just a failure for me. But upon a couple of years ago, I did reread Midnight Tides via audio, and I had no problem rereading it via audio. But as a first time read, I couldn't do it just with audio. So I'm always impressed if somebody can do that.
I can't imagine listening to them on audio, but I'm very, very new to audio. It's not because I don't think you can do it. It's just last year was the first time I listened to an audio book completely. So it's a very different experience to reading it in person or reading the book. And I just get distracted. And it is already a very complex series. So I think for me, I would get lost also in an audio book. But you
Yeah.
never know. Maybe a few years down the track, it'll be different. Not quite yet. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I mean, I don't know for sure, but I'm just gonna suspect that some people are able to like reinforce some kind of neural pathways in which they're able to process the audio really well,
Yeah.
and be able to track everything is still just like they're reading with their eyes. I have not quite acquired that skill to that level when it comes to
Yeah.
fantasy, or science fiction for that matter, but it's very impressive. So Dead House Gates was your favorite book in the series, Joseph?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And
Oh,
Kathy,
Out of
would
all of them,
out of all of them,
out
sorry.
of all of them, yeah. Yeah, so far it is definitely my favorite. Plus, no, it is my favorite. It hasn't been toppled yet, but I did really love Bone Hunters,
mm,
which I read recently. I did love that one.
incredible book. Incredible book.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm. So I'm looking forward to seeing what I think of the rest, but I'm
Yeah.
quite excited to finish it because I'm close now and it's going to be hard to space them out. I want to just read one after the other, but it's been about a year since I've started them, just under a year. So I should be done in a couple of months, hopefully.
That's exciting. Are you gonna reread them probably someday too, or
Oh, for sure. But first, I think I want to read Esselmon's books.
yeah.
And I want to read the other books that Erickson has read. I want to read everything he's written, really. And then I'll go back and I'll start it again.
Yeah.
So speaking of other things he's written, I absolutely love his Willful Child series, which is a Star Trek
Oh,
spoof, and it's so
yes.
good.
I
They're
read
so
about that.
funny. I love them so
I have
much.
to read that.
That's
Yeah,
cool.
that's on my radar. I saw that and I thought, look, I love Star Trek. And Stephen Erickson wrote it. I'm definitely going to read that as well.
I know he's a huge Star Trekkie. I've never been a
Mm,
Star Trek fan, but I don't know, maybe
I am.
I
I
I
am.
do I do want to
I'm a
read
Trekkie.
oh, you are a Trekkie.
I'm a Trekkie. Yeah.
Yeah.
See, I'm not even that big of a fan of Star Trek, and it's still just so good. Just having the
Mhm.
osmosis of being in the culture that Star Trek is around, like you, is enough to enjoy Willful Child. Because
Mm.
the first one is, I think, basically the premise is, what if you put Captain Kirk on the Next Generation's ship as the captain? Because everyone's
Oh,
all by the rules and stuff, and then the commander is just like, we're just gonna do it. Doesn't matter what
Kirk's the
regulations say.
Maverick.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's hilarious.
That would be funny, actually, because Next Gen is my favorite. And I'm not going to go on a Star Trek tangent, but I just can imagine having Kirk on Picard's
It
ship.
it's absurd.
Yeah,
It's so good.
it would.
I have to tell my mom about that because she loves Star Trek.
Mm,
But I am excited because I've heard. I don't know if this. I don't know. I wonder if this would interest you, Kathy. I know this will interest Joseph. Um, I I understand that Stephen Erickson is in the process of writing a book about writing, and I'm not myself a
mm,
writer. Like I have no interest in being a writer of fiction anyway. I enjoy my own kind of like nonfiction writing, I suppose. But I am so interested in reading his book about writing because every
mm,
discussion I've ever heard with Stephen Erickson on YouTube where he's talked about his writing process has been extraordinary. Like I feel like I've learned so much about so many technical aspects of writing and so much about like what I'm reading and how an author is able to engage me and play with the psychology of the characters, all types of aspects just from listening to his talks on YouTube. So I cannot wait to get my hands on his book about writing.
Oh yeah, same.
yeah, I won't be reading it. I will admit that I'm not really interested in fiction writing. I have written some stuff in the past. In my youth, I used to write stories all the time, even a few books, but just for fun, not for actually publishing. But even Stephen King, who's one of my favorites, I haven't read his book on writing either. So,
That book's
yeah,
very good. I love that
I
book. I've
know
read
a
it
lot of
two or
people
three
say
times now.
that. Yeah. I think if you want to write in particular, yes, I think it would be extremely useful to read a book on writing by an author as successful and prolific as Stephen King or Stephen Erickson. Both Stevens, I just realized. But yeah, I think they may become my two favorites. Isn't that strange? I never thought that before. I never realized I'm in love with two authors who are both called Stephen.
Oh, that's a good
Sorry.
point.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
different spelled
Just
differently,
realized that.
but yeah,
Yes, spelled differently, but well, it's Stephen. Yeah, yeah, that's right. Stephen King is with a PH. Yeah.
but it's pronounced the same. So yeah,
Mm, mm,
that's really interesting. I love. I do own. I haven't read very many books about writing. Especially fiction. I do own On Write. Is it On Writing by Joseph Gardner? I know that I just bought the book too. The fiction writing on fiction writing, writing fiction. I can't remember the name of the book by Gardner, John Gardner.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I've read it and I can't remember the name of it either.
Yes. So the reason I like reading books about writing, or like I enjoyed reading that book in particular. Oh, and I also read Ursula K. Le Guin's Steering the Craft on Writing. So I read that one as well. And the reason I enjoy
mm,
reading books about writing is because I think it enhances my ability to appreciate prose more, like what the author is doing with the sentence on the sentence level. And I feel like when we're talking about writing style or tone or prose in our videos for our reviews, it's helpful to understand what the author is doing. So I'm not saying I'm the best at it by any means, but I feel like those books have been incredibly illuminating as far as those things are concerned.
That is
I
why I
think that's a
started
really
reading.
good point.
Would you
Yeah,
say,
I'm
Joseph? I'm
sorry,
sorry.
Jason.
Oh, no, that is why I read so many books about writing. Is I mean, I think in my early 20s, I read everything at like surface level and didn't really pay attention to
Mm,
how it was written or why and all that. And I got into reading books about writing as a way to kind of teach myself to understand it beneath like the surface, the writing, and kind of why a writer does what they do. And it's greatly improved my appreciation for what writers do.
Yes,
to
absolutely.
make me consider it now. Perhaps I do need to read Stephen King's or Stephen
So
Erickson's books on writing.
on writing is a great example. Like Stephen King's book is a great example because he talks about why he writes the way he does and exactly his process. And I read that, and then I read The Shining, and The Shining is a perfect execution of how he tells you you should write books.
Mm,
I mean, it is
mm,
exactly as he intended to write it. It made me
mm,
appreciate the book a lot more.
mm.
Wow, I'll keep that in mind. So if I ever
Yeah.
get to The Shining, maybe I'll read Stephen King's book before I read it so I can experience what you're talking about. That's so neat. And
Yeah.
Kathy, I would say, like, even if you're not interested in reading books about writing, which I understand is like a very specialized nerdy nerdy hobby, that even just goes extra nerd level past us being nerds on BookTube. I would say even just look up Steven Erickson's discussions on YouTube with, A Critical Dragon, AP Canavan,
Mm,
because he's brought up
I've seen
so
those.
many. Yeah. I mean, there are so many different things that he talks about, like, for example, psychic distance, which I feel like we use that term differently, and maybe I need to look up what that term means. I know Gardner is the
Mm,
came up with this term, and I've heard people use it to refer to psychic distance as far as, like, whether I'm here reading a book and I feel like I'm in our world, whether the psychic distance means I'm in another realm when I'm reading the book. But actually the way I've heard it from what I understood of what it means in another context is how close you feel to the character that you're reading about. So I think there are different ways of defining that term, but he basically talks about
mm,
these techniques he uses to make you feel really closed in to the character or zoomed out. He talks about ways in which he changes his writing style so that you feel the pace slow down or speed up. And those are things
mm,
that I feel like get brushed over sometimes if we don't really know what we're how we're experiencing a book, because then we sometimes, if we're talking a review, and I'm guilty of this too, I'll say something like, "This is a slow burn book," or "This is a fast-paced book," without unpacking that. And is it really slow all the way through? Or was the author intentionally trying to slow it down in some places to build up suspense? Were they trying to speed it up here? Just little devices like that that we don't really pay
mm.
much attention to that I
I
can.
hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, and for me,
Yeah.
I can understand for some people, maybe that pulls them out of the story in a negative way, that they start realizing what the author's doing, but for me, it actually makes it more interesting to me on a different level.
I
There's
think
a
perhaps for
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think perhaps for me, I like the mystery of not knowing what the author's intending when I'm reading a book. I'd like to just read it and experience it and see how I feel in relation to that book based on the writing. And I've never wanted to actually analyze too deeply the structure of a book. I'm more interested in the story and how it's going to unfold and how it's going to impact me. So perhaps for that reason, I haven't read any nonfiction on writing, but that might be also what's holding me back is my concern that it'll make it a little less mysterious and enjoyable for me. But that's just what I've always thought. It doesn't mean it's right. It
Yeah.
might work for other people, but yeah, I think though I might consider reading Stephen King's. I've been wanting to for a while, and I guess I can start it and see what I think, right? Yeah.
Most of it is an autobiography, so it's
Mm,
maybe a third of it at most is about writing. Most of it is about his life, and so it's very good.
mm.
Yeah.
I'm reading his Dark Tower series again on my channel. We're doing a read along and just comparing The Gunslinger, which is the first book he wrote, one of the very early books he wrote, and then reading The Drawing of the Three. It's such a sharp contrast in his writing style. It's noticeable that he has learned so much since the first book, and it's much more familiar as well, the second book, because it is more similar to his earlier style of writing. But there's no doubt over the years as an author, he has changed his style in some ways. He's honed his skills. But I also still love his very early writing, which perhaps he might be more critical of, or others might be. But I think they're just as impactful as his later books. But it is interesting to see how an author develops over time in their writing, how that changes. I've also seen some changes in Stephen Erickson's style over the course of the books that I've been reading. So I'll be interested to see how much that does change towards the end of the series.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Before I respond to that point in particular, is there anyone who has an answer to this question? Joseph, do you have an answer to whether The Willful Child is it a
Yeah,
finished series?
it's a
It is
finished series.
finished,
It's
I
a
think.
trilogy.
Ah, okay.
Mm.
Good to know. I just wanted to make sure I answered that question. That's a really good point, though, about seeing the progression of someone's style. As far
Mm,
as like the Stephen King I've read, the I haven't read a lot as much as you have by any means, by either of you probably, because I think both of you are very well read when it comes to Stephen King. But I have read the Dark Tower series. I have read it. I have read Salem's Lot. I have read Pet Cemetery, 11/22/63. I think those are in Fairy Tale and a short story. But I have noticed like Salem's Lot is remarkably different than some of his
mm,
later books, for sure. Like,
yeah,
that's the one that stands out the most to me. But I think, you
very
know,
good too.
it's a very good book, yeah,
Yeah,
but I think, like,
yeah.
it's it's also partly I think some of that could also be informed by trends, what's trending
Mhm.
in the publishing industry, and then
Yeah.
I mean, I could be wrong about that, but it could be a factor, and then as far as, like, other authors, though, and how their writing style has changed, I could certainly see that when it comes to the Malazan series with Erickson's writing, like you said, Kathy. Um, I think that the author that stands out the most to me as far as, like, a change and drastic change I've noticed, and I'm not even that huge a fan, honestly, but Pierce Brown with the Red Rising trilogy, I feel like his writing skills, to me, I thought improved dramatically book to book in that original trilogy.
Yeah, I
Mm,
agree.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, the first one, it was I really loved the Red Rising series. I love the entire trilogy. I haven't read the later books because I've been waiting for them to finish,
yeah.
but I certainly noticed a change in his writing style. And you expect that with a new writer, that the first book is his first attempt at something, just like anything else. With repetition, you should improve, hopefully. But yes, there is definitely an improvement in his writing. I think so,
Yeah,
anyway.
I think so
Mm,
too. Yeah,
mm.
absolutely. Um,
Night
yeah.
Shift Slapped, Mitch is saying. Yes, that is one of his best short story collections. I've read pretty much almost everything King's written, except for his latest few books. I kind of save a few, and then I read them all together at once. So I have a few now to read. But this is an older short story collection of his, one of his early ones, and it's really, really good. It has some fantastic short stories. And
Speak
that I think is also perhaps unusual in an author, to find one who not only can write massive tomes that are 1,000 pages, but also very effective short stories. It's usually one or the other. They don't usually, or aren't usually, very good at writing both a short story and a very long book.
That is a
Mm,
skill. That's also a skill that I've just recently appreciated in Ken Liu's writing, just based on the
mm,
first Dandelion book I've read and then the Paper Menagerie short story collection. But when it comes to Stephen King, I've only read one short story, and I read one that was in his most recent collection, If You Like It Darker collection, and I read it because I read the Flannery O'Connor short story, A Good Man Is Hard to Find, and I heard that his story in that short story collection on Slide Road was a tribute to Flannery O'Connor, and if you read
oh,
those 2 stories side by side, it is brilliant the way that Stephen King tips off his hat to Flannery O'Connor. It's brilliant.
mm,
Like, they're similar and different, but they're definitely different enough, and at the same time, like, certainly a wonderful homage to Flannery O'Connor. But Flannery O'Connor too, man, what a brilliant writer. I feel like I've only read that one story by her, but it left a mark, and I need to read more by that author as well. Uh, but as far as, like, that's such a good point, though, about how well that he's able to write. Um, would you Joseph, do you prefer his short stories, or do you prefer his longer fiction when it comes to Stephen King?
probably is longer fiction. I don't think I've read enough. Night Shift is on my TBR because John D. MacDonald wrote the introduction to that,
Oh,
and John
yes.
D. MacDonald's one of my favorite writers, and he was one of King's favorite writers.
Yeah.
So I'm really looking forward to checking it out.
wow. Okay, cool. Yeah, I think it's neat how well connected Stephen King is. I mean, he's also somebody, like I mentioned, he did that tribute to Flannery O'Connor. He seems to be somebody who really wears his influences on his sleeve, so to speak. I think that's the way it's often said. He's somebody who obviously pays a lot of tribute to, like, in the Dark Tower series alone to the poetry of Browning and I think T.S. Eliot, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, so by the way,
Isn't
I want to say hi really quickly to Ellen. I'm sorry you're
Ellen?
sick.
Yeah, sorry to hear that.
No. That sucks. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, he's also been influenced by people like Robert Browning, the Dark Tower series,
Yes.
the Gunslinger, or the name Roland comes from the poem. I think it's The Child Roland. He's very well read, and I think it comes through in his books. And I don't have a problem with an author having strong views and including them in his books as long as I don't feel preached at. That's what I don't want. But I actually like an author who is passionate about something and takes a stance, whether I agree with it or not, as long as they're not trying to force their views onto you. And it's a fine line sometimes. You can feel very preached at times. So,
Are there
mm.
any books in particular that you feel like were
Oh, I
preachy?
tried Stephanie Meyer's Twilight book, the first one, and I gave up after 10 pages. I just felt like she really had an agenda for me. Hi, Dom. Hmm. So, yeah, I like an author taking a stand on something, whatever it is. I know some people say, like even on YouTube, you shouldn't talk politics. We're only talking about books, but politics is also part of life, just generally. And I don't think you can always easily separate the two, especially in books. So I have no objection to people bringing up their views in a book, even if it is something I don't agree with. But I know some people prefer everything to be neutral. Life's not like that, unfortunately. Mm.
No. Yeah. What about you, Joseph? Do you have any preference when it comes to like books that have a really maybe the way the Rogue put it, have authors who have an axe to grind, or if you prefer ones that maybe don't encounter those conversations as much, or maybe are just a little more subtle? Do you have any sort of preference when it comes to that?
No, I honestly think it just comes down to execution. I'm down for anything as long as it's done well. It just makes it even better when they do have something they're trying to get across and they just do it in a way that, like you said, doesn't feel preachy. And I think it really does add to the book.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting, it's actually one of my favorite topics, to be honest with you. I'm gonna highlight Gavin here, though, rereading the Hunger Games series, and it's so political. It is political.
It
I've only read
is.
the first book.
It is.
And by the way, I want to say, Gavin, that I got excited that to see on your manga channel that you're reading Free Rin, because I am watching the anime right now, and I'm not finished, so I can't watch anything spoilery yet. But oh, it's like my favorite thing in the world right now. I'm obsessed
Oh,
with Free Rin, the anime, just as a side note.
Gavin's also reading all the Stephen King books at the moment. And it's really interesting seeing someone who's reading them for the first time.
Yeah, yeah. I think some of them he was rereading, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, I love Gavin.
Yeah.
Gavin has such fun vlogs, so
Mm.
yeah, it
Yeah,
is
I love his
fun.
blog.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
So,
check out Gavin, everyone. Yeah,
so speaking of the Hunger Games and politics, do you know the origin for the books?
I have heard
She
this before, but I can't
so
remember.
when she was watching TV, and on one channel she had C-SPAN, which showed 19-year-olds fighting in Afghanistan, and then she flipped to MTV, and there's 19-year-olds on a reality TV show acting like narcissists, and she was just thinking about the entertainment value of both those things and putting them together, and
Oh,
that's one of the catalysts for the Hunger Games.
I didn't know that.
no, me either.
Oh
It's
wow.
one of my favorite YA series. I'm not a fan of YA, but I loved The Hunger Games when I read them. Loved the films as well, but I thought the books were really good. I might have a few gripes here and there, but overall it was so well written, and it didn't come across as a young adult series. It just had young adult protagonists. So, but it was such a clever idea.
Yeah, I read the first book with my mother. I remember at the time I was recovering from hernia surgery, and I think she was into it more than I was. I liked it okay, but I think that was also the reason I decided I wasn't really into dystopian because it is dystopian,
Mm,
and I think that that set the flavor for me. I'm like, maybe I'm just not into dystopian, and I decided not to read on because I was concerned that maybe books 2 and 3 just went back into the arena, and I'm like, "I'm kinda tired of this setting and the
mm,
same kinda circular plot," and my mom said that that's kind of what they did, and so because she read on, I didn't.
mm.
So I never read on, I never even saw the movies, and
Oh,
and I think
you
that's
missed out.
probably,
Films are good.
probably,
The films are good. Mm,
yeah. I'm curious though, uh when you said that I wanna make sure K Fox's comment is here. I love The Hunger Games. I read them as they came out, but I haven't reread them since. And I'll go ahead and highlight Mitch's comments here. Flannery definitely preaching at me.
mhm,
I don't know. I have thoughts on that. Absolutely tearing people like me apart. I was here for it though. She did it so skillfully. I think she did it very skillfully because A Good Man is Hard to Find, extremely bleak story, extremely bleak, and yet at the same time, my mother I had to call my mother, and we talked about that short story for, like, an hour on the phone because I didn't feel like I totally understood it. I didn't feel like I totally grasped it, and I think it's also important to understand Flannery O'Connor's background as a Catholic, which my mom is, I'm not anymore. But just getting more of understanding what she was trying to get at was not so obvious to me on the onset.
mm.
But once we talked about it, I'm like, "Oh, okay, I get it." So I don't know. I mean, I guess it
I'll
could
have
be
to read
considered
it.
that. It's good.
Yeah,
I thought it was
I have
brilliant. I
to
think
read
you'd
it.
like it. I think you'd like it.
Mm,
Yes, I highly
mm,
recommend it. And to you too, Joseph, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend A Good Man is Hard to Find.
mm,
But because we brought up the topic of subgenres, another topic that I love, Madame Vader says here that they enjoy dystopian books. I read a book recently that is my favorite book of the year so far, or one of my favorite books of the year so far, and it's considered dystopian, though I'm not sure I totally qualify it as such. And it's called, gosh, what is it called? I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman. I Brilliant book, brilliant book. So I'd say it's dystopian enough that if you like dystopian fiction, check it out. But I
mm.
really wanted to get into the subgenre conversation here, and maybe before even going into subgenre specifically, I know this isn't considered a subgenre, but YA. So you said, Kathy, that you're not into YA. Is there any particular thing
Yeah.
that sets you apart from YA?
I think even when I was a child, I didn't enjoy books that were geared towards young adults or teenagers. That's what we call the books. I remember that there was a lot of fiction that at that time that was in our school library, and I just thought, I'm not interested in kids' problems. I want to read about adult life and all of this. And I think it's just spilled over from there. I don't think it's so much that I can't relate to younger characters, it's more the style of writing. And I did try a few, like I read Hunger Games series and I loved it. I tried Divergent, did not like that one. I tried Shadow and Bone, really didn't like that one. So it's, I think, just something that doesn't appeal to me, depending on the writing style. It depends on the kind of language used in the dialogue. Sometimes it felt a little too much geared at a very young audience, and I'm a much older person now, so I did not relate to that either. And I just find that it's something I've never enjoyed. So, yeah,
Yeah.
it's,
Yeah.
what can you
Just
say?
curious.
I think we all have things we dislike. You mentioned you're not a huge fan, I think, of dystopian. Didn't you say? Yeah. And for me, I think it's YA.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I don't even know if that's true about me in dystopian. I just know I think because I was so mid on Hunger Games that it made me think that just doesn't sound interesting to me. And I guess I have read a couple of books. Trying to think of other dystopian books I've read. I've read other books that are considered dystopian that I've
Mm,
loved, but I don't know. I think it's mostly just if I think of dystopian and I consider it, we had a whole discussion in the fireside about what constitutes dystopian. If we
Mm.
consider it a future reality where there's an authoritarian dictatorship government and people have no agency and there's I don't know, just almost this gray atmosphere. That's what I always picture in my head, like a gray, austere setting and tone. That just does not sound fun to me at all, like, it just doesn't
Mm.
sound like something I would enjoy, but I've been
But
proven wrong. I could be proven wrong. Yeah.
it could also include a society that has broken down, where there is no authoritarian figures. It's just that the world has changed so much that it has become dystopian.
So here's the thing, I did ask this in the fireside, if there was a difference between post-apocalyptic and dystopian, or do those 2 things have to be are they different or are they combined? If it's dystopian, is it
They can cross
post-apocalyptic
over,
or,
I
vice versa?
yeah.
And everyone in the fireside said, "No, they are definitely 2 different distinct
Mm.
things." Post-apocalyptic could be a little more appealing to me for some reason because there's a little more open-ended. So there's a little more but for some reason, I think and this is again my preconception, and I've proven myself wrong before about this, but dystopian in my head, it feels very confined. I haven't read 1984, I'll be honest, it's like on
I
my
loved it.
TBR of
Yeah.
shame. I have it on my shelf. I watched an adaptation as a kid and I was like, "Ugh, I don't like
Mm.
this big brother watching me everywhere,"
Yeah.
and I know so many elements of our real life feel a bit dystopian, but I just yeah, it just doesn't there's something confining every time I think about it, but I could be proven wrong, and like I said, I loved I Who Have Never Known Men, and that could
Mm.
be slightly considered dystopian. I would say it's more post-apocalyptic, but, it's brilliant in my opinion because it does explore things so in depth.
So is 1984. It is
Okay,
really brilliant. Yeah, it's
I'm gonna
worth
read it.
reading.
I'm gonna read it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also loved Fahrenheit 451. I think that is also worth reading, especially as it deals with book bans and things like that. And it was written, I think, in the 1950s. And yet, when I read it only a few years ago, I thought it's still so relevant today. It seems to have predicted the future almost. And I was very impressed with it.
Yeah, I still haven't read that either.
Mm.
Mitch says I'd say post-apocalyptic involves some sort of technical social regression after a cataclysmic event. Yeah, that's good. I like that. I like that definition of post-apocalyptic. And K
Mm.
Fox, by the way, I'm reading Left Hand of Darkness. I think you'd love to hear that. But I did love The Dispossessed. But I think the one difference, I do agree that there is a dystopian element to one of the planets in The Dispossessed because there are 2 planets and I at the same time, we get enough contrast with the other planet that I didn't feel like it was too much of this one thing, and it's also exploring society. The society there is there's still a societal structure well, obviously, dystopian does explore societal structures. Yeah, it could be considered dystopian. I agree with that, but I think it's also, yeah, dysfunctional utopia is correct. But I do think that there's enough contrast with other things that it didn't seem to bog me down. I don't know. It's maybe one of those exceptions, though.
Mm. I
Joseph,
actually do love dystopian myself. I
oh,
love
good.
anything that is out of the ordinary, that isn't like our current world, even if it is similar in some way. But when it changes the way society is structured from our world, that's what I consider dystopian, as separate from post apocalyptic. And I love stories like that. I'm really drawn to it because I think in those kinds of situations, whether it's a dystopian or dysfunctional utopia or a post apocalyptic setting, we're putting people in extraordinary situations that are not familiar to us. So I love exploring how they will behave in those situations, in those cultures.
Oh my gosh, Kathy, can I talk you into reading The Dispossessed by Ursula K.
Oh,
Le
I'm going
Guin?
to read it. I've got it
Oh,
actually. It's on my shelf. It's on my TBR. I've just committed to too many read-alongs
oh,
and
I
buddy reads,
understand.
and
Yeah.
I haven't been able to pick up just something at random, but I definitely am going to read that.
Well, the reason I love that book so much is because we are exploring societal themes specifically on two different
Mm,
planets. One is an Earth-like planet, and it's very capitalistic, warring nations, a lot of greed, people owning things. Its ownership is a big thing, just like our world in a sense. And then in the Moon-like planet, it is dystopian, utopian, utopian, but it's also anarchist. And so
mm,
I don't I'm sure there are other books that explore an anarchist society. But I had never read about an anarchist society before. And just
mm.
hearing the way it was organized and the way it functioned was such a fascinating exploration, especially because we keep jumping between those 2 settings. So, like, the contrast of those 2 things and then the questions it brings up when it comes to, like, privacy and ownership of ideas, so many interesting questions that come up. I thought it was a fascinating exploration. One caveat to this, and I've had a lot of discussions with people about this. Some people do find it didactic. That's the word Jared Henderson used, that like they think it's Ursula K. Le Guin is being preachy. I don't feel like she's being preachy at all.
Okay.
I feel like she's being very intentionally ambiguous with certain things, with the themes, but some people think of it as like good planet, dystopian, utopian, bad planet, the planet like our world. I don't think she's doing that, but that's just my take. You can make your own decision, of course, but I do
Yeah.
want to bring that up because I know some people, if you're sensitive to like, I'm being preached at, I don't know. That's the only thing that might be a drawback, but I didn't
I've
feel like
only
that.
read two of her Earthsea books so far, and I don't get the impression of preachiness from this author, but I haven't read her science fiction, so I'm very curious to try that as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm so sorry, Joseph. I've like totally left you out of this conversation. Tell us your thoughts on dystopian and yeah, dystopian fiction.
I like dystopian fiction. I mean, I've read all like the heavy hitters like 1984 and Fahrenheit 451, and I think that as much as I think that like when it comes to books that are considered grimdark, usually they have a dystopian element to them, and I think that's what I like about them. And I think that uh, I think that one of the reasons you, Joanna, might like Malazan is because it doesn't have those dystopian elements to them. And people call it grimdark all the time, and I'm like, it's not. Like the Malazan series is not grimdark. It's not dystopian. It's not nihilistic. So
No,
yeah,
I agree with you on that.
Mhm. Yeah. So Joseph, since you brought that up too, and by the way, you both are making me want to read more dystopian fiction. And I'll just be honest,
That's
because I
good.
also I also love proving myself wrong about things I don't like. I love proving myself wrong about things I think I don't like in fiction, and then discovering something
It's
new.
good to
That's like
try new
yeah,
things.
I love
Yeah, or
I love
different things.
yes.
Mm,
And so Joseph, since you brought up misconceptions in grimdark, would you mind expanding on this? Because I love this topic too, and
mm.
I have a lot of thoughts on it. But what do you feel constitutes grimdark, and where do you think people might get it wrong, or maybe come up with definitions that you feel are don't fit in with what you think constitutes grimdark?
I've given this a lot of thought, and I've written multiple scripts to make videos, and then just not done them because I usually just get mad about it. So grimdark, the major elements of grimdark are it needs to be dystopian, it nihilistic, and there has to be it. One of the major elements is might is right, and it is the kind of the people say it's like anti-Tolkien, but I don't think it's that. I think it's more of a there's a heavy emphasis on the costs of kingdom politics. Like they take real politic to the extreme in grimdark books. You especially see that in things like Mark Lawrence's Broken Empire series. Isn't that what it's called? The one with it's
I think so.
Prince of Thorns
Haven't
and
read
King of
that one
Thorns.
yet.
There the
Mm.
politics are brutal. It's just nasty, and that is definitely grimdark. And another thing is that there's a heavy focus on the psychological costs of being the person wielding the sword. And some people call just random things grimdark because it's like, oh, it's grimdark because women are assaulted and people get murdered for no reason, and it's like that's not
Yeah.
grimdark. Like that's just usually bad writing.
Mm.
Well, I mean, horrible things just happen in life. It doesn't mean it's actually grim dark. And I agree with that. I don't think, based on what I've looked at online as to definitions, grim dark does involve things like nihilism. It involves, it doesn't involve, I should say, it's probably easier to exclude the things it doesn't involve, such as exploring, say, other the human condition or morality or any of that. Grimdark seems to be more about, I don't know how to describe it, but I just never thought, for example, that Malazan or even Glenn Cook is grimdark as such. It may not have, well, I always think that there is a moral in both of these book series, that they actually have more to say than just saying we're just existing for the sake of existing and let's just kill everyone in the world. And that's a very simplistic definition of it, but that seems to be what most people consider to be grim dark. I'm not as well read in this subject as I should be, but I know that Stephen Erickson does not consider Malazan to be grim dark, and from what I've seen, I don't think it is either.
Yeah.
It,
Go ahead. Go ahead, Joseph.
yeah, it's definitely not grimdark. And the other thing is here's my hottest take. I don't think grimdark is a genre, mostly because everyone
Mm,
calls so many different things grimdark that it has no meaning. It's like the villain from The Incredibles where he said once, if everyone's super, then no one is. If everything's grimdark, then nothing is. And even grimdark writers, I'm in different groups where they comment, like it's like Facebook groups, and even the grimdark writers themselves are like, I don't write grimdark. I'm just writing stories that I want to tell, and people are labeling them grimdark more than anything.
I
I think,
agree with this, Joseph.
yeah,
I've actually
yeah,
gone as far as I almost made a video about this too, and then I kind of like, I'll give up. But at least we're having this conversation now, which is that I don't like labeling books grimdark anymore. I did at one
yeah,
point, but now I don't like that unless the author themselves say my book is grimdark. I might say it just because the author said it, but I don't like labeling books grim dark. I think if you wanted to use if I wanted to use a term, then I would probably prefer saying this has grim dark elements. But then even then, I would have to unpack what I mean by that. Because like you said, it's not enough like if you have dark elements in a book, that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as grimdark and some people make a distinction between what is grimdark, what is dark specifically, dark fantasy versus grimdark. Like some people don't even say that the Second Apocalypse series,
mm,
which Dom is saying here, his favorite grimdark to date is the Second Apocalypse series, though he hasn't finished the series. Some people would say that that's simply just dark fantasy and not grimdark. So the terms get so complicated. And then the other reason that I have an issue with using it as a genre term, it's kind of like what you were saying too. I think it's like people talk about the First Law series by Joe Abercrombie, and then they put that like the same genre as George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series. Those two series, in my opinion, while both great fantasy series, some of my favorite of all time, are so different in what they're trying to accomplish.
yeah,
So totally different. And even the tone is different. The tone of the series is very different to me. So I feel like that is almost too reductive to talk about, especially what A Song of Ice and Fire is doing to call it grimdark. And even with what Abercrombie's doing, it also I can't tell you how many people say, I read Joe Abercrombie's series. I thought it was grimdark and I thought it was funny. And I'm like, yeah, well, the whole entire genre term is just completely confusing, I think, to people. And I just like as from a reviewer standpoint, I don't have any. It's not that I have anything against people using the term. It's more like if I use the term, I feel like it's just more confusing than it is clarifying. And if you're going to
yeah,
use a genre term, it should be clarifying. Like, what is this book trying to do? What is its aim? So I feel like it's either too reductive or it's too confusing. and that's my issue with the term grimdark.
I think it's because of the two words. If you separate them, yes, a word can be grim. Yes, it can be dark, but it has other meanings that people place on the books when you combine the two words together. But the truth is, yes, there is a lot of series, including A Song of Ice and Fire, which is grim. You can call it dark, but I wouldn't call it grim dark as it's defined as a genre. And I agree that labels aren't always useful, that in fact it narrows your perspective of a book or series because you expect something based on the label that it's been given. Better not to give it any label at all, except maybe a very general one like it's fantasy with dark elements or grim elements.
Yes, I prefer that. I prefer just, I mean, because I think we are going to use labels. I use labels all the time when I'm talking about a book, but I think it's
Mm,
like when we make it all one specific full
yeah.
label, that's where things get way too reductive and confusing. And
Yes.
again, like I said, I think there could be exceptions to that. Like if the author themselves owns that label, like Travis Baldree, I'm imagining owns Cozy Fantasy for Legends and Lattes. That's totally appropriate. Or like, for example, Ken Liu, he created this term silk punk to talk about his series.
Mm,
I still don't know that I fully get what he means by silk punk. I still haven't read all those papers that he wrote, but still, like, I mean, even then, it's helpful maybe. But then, even if you use the label, there's nothing wrong with that, especially if it rings true and it's what the author themselves says. But then, even then, I feel like you have to unpack things. Like you,
yeah.
yeah. But you're right, and I do want to bring up Capricious Fox here. Their comment about Warhammer 40K because I know that that was certainly where the term came from. And
I have a
yeah, even
story for
then,
that.
yeah,
So between that and the Rogue asking, wasn't the term meant to be more satirical initially? Yeah, the origin of Grimdark is a quote from Warhammer 40K from the 1980s, and it's in the grimdark future. It's basically in the grimdark future, there is only war, and it is satirical. Like that's the whole thing about Warhammer 40K is most of it is a satire of
Mm,
fascism, and so people
mm.
taking it seriously are, like I've said before, the same people that don't realize a show like The Boys is satire. It's like a lot of it is tongue in cheek, especially in early 40K. There was literally a character named Obi-Wan Clouseau or something that was a detective, and it's just so
Oh, what a
ridiculous. And
combo.
yes, yeah, and it's supposed to be. It was initially satirical, and then I guess people ran with it in the early aughts on the internet and started calling everything grimdark.
that's funny.
Mm. We do like putting labels onto things because it makes things simpler. It
Hmm.
makes it easy for somebody to know, okay, this book is fantasy or cozy fantasy or epic fantasy. But I also think it is narrowing somebody's perspective of a book if you tell or if you say it is grimdark or cozy. I prefer to leave it more broad so that it will appeal to more people because it may not necessarily be as narrow as some of those labels are.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that and this is just me being pedantic about things, I think probably, but I mean, I do think like the broad labels help. It's all fantasy and at the same time, like if I'm trying to sell some if I'm not necessarily trying to sell things, but if I'm trying to like pitch a book to somebody who I think might enjoy it or explain what they might be in for to I might wanna just go a little further. Like, for example, using this metal analogy here, you could say Nightwish, is metal, Metallica is then you if you like metal, then you might like Metallica, which they're totally different. Like, even though they're metal, like, you would I think if I were wanting to get somebody to go to a Metallica concert, I might wanna, like, explain a little bit of background just a little bit more. So, I
Mm,
know that's me being pedantic, but I just feel like
no,
yeah,
I
I just
agree with
wanna
you on this.
I
Yeah.
wanna break things down
Mhm.
a little bit more.
Yeah, I like the labels of genres just because they work as a good device for discussing what a book is made of and kind of where it fits into the grand scheme of speculative fiction.
Yeah. Exactly. Really well said. Really well said. Yeah. Yeah. Do you two have any favorite subgenre when it comes to books?
Oh,
I imagine you
I
both
love
love fantasy the best, but that's just my guess. But
I mean, yeah,
fantasy and
it's
for me legal fiction, but I haven't read a bit of that in a while. But that used to be my jam. I
what is
used
it?
to
I'm
love
sorry.
legal fiction
Legal
or
fiction.
books based on courtroom dramas, things like that. Not John Grisham. I don't like John Grisham at all,
me either.
but yeah, I don't. I really dislike him, but yeah, I love a lot of other legal fiction. That used to be my thing. That Stephen King and fantasy. That is definitely my favorite. But I don't know if I could say a subgenre. I'm really enjoying reading broadly in fantasy, epic, and urban. I never thought I would like urban, but I've discovered I really enjoy urban fantasy now.
Fantasy.
And I love the Glenn Cook books. I have really enjoyed those and I want to read more of those, which I didn't think I would because people labeled them as grimdark. And I thought maybe grimdark isn't my thing, but I think also your tastes change with time. And I've noticed that I'm willing to read darker fantasy now, whereas when I was younger, I definitely liked more uplifting or epic fantasy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
This is a funny comment from Mitch that I killed. No, I killed Grimdark after killing Epic Fantasy. Oh no. Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah. Really interesting. Okay. And Joseph, what about you?
It's always been fantasy, but lately my new favorite genre has been thrillers, especially like crime thrillers. I've been having so much fun with pretty much all of them, but mainly I keep preaching about how good John D. MacDonald is, but
Yeah.
also I've been kind of dabbling in a lot of older crime fiction and I've just been having a lot of fun with it.
Yeah. I
Have you
love
read?
what sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go on. I was just going to ask about Raymond Chandler. Have you read some of the
Yep.
old classics like that?
I
Yeah.
love The Big Sleep. It's such a good book.
Mm,
It's so
me
fun.
too.
It's
Yeah.
there's no better way to explore Los Angeles in like 1949. You just it speaking of escapism, you're just there and it's so
Yeah.
amazing.
Wow. Well, that's really fun. And by the way, you two are some of my favorite channels to go to when it comes to talking about a lot of backlisted books as well, meaning books
Oh,
that were not written within the last 10, 20 years, like books that were written
yeah.
further back, which is so fun because then I learn about so many books that don't get talked about very often.
I'm working on a video to list a lot of books that I read in the 80s and 90s that I don't see talked about a lot on YouTube. Yeah, it's going to take a while because there's a lot of different series, and I'm just going to be talking about those series that I've read. It's not an exclusive list, but it's funny how when I started my channel, or talking about books, I should say, I was surprised at how few channels did actually talk about older series. It was always the new, what is out today. And I thought, yeah, well, my experience has been all these older fantasies, and I'd like to talk about them as well. So I do enjoy talking about the older series.
Ooh, that
And I know
reminds
that
me,
Joseph
there
does.
is one author that I mean, even though I feel like I'm not as well read as you two when it comes to older stuff, I I know the three of us have read one author that has been an absolute gem for me, at least based on two books I've read so far, and that is Tanith Lee. Tanith Lee, I read Electric Forest by this author a couple of years ago. She made it into my top 10 of the year. That book was brilliant. Did not expect it to go the direction it went. And then it's a very short book, by the way. So, highly recommend people check it out. Uh, John Mates, who is Jenny Wirtz's husband, did the artwork for one of the covers of that book, and it's so good. It's like the best cover of that book. And then I started her Flat Earth series, and that kind of sent me down a rabbit hole because I started her Flat Earth series with Knight's Master, which I know Joseph you've read too, and
Yeah.
it sent me down a rabbit hole because I realized this is an era of fantasy that I did not that hadn't quite explored before. And so it led me to read Jack Vance's Tales of a Dying Earth, just the first tale, the Dying Earth tale, basically,
Hmm.
which is kind of almost it feels almost like a collection of short stories, just
It
that one
is.
tale. But it made me think, wow, this is so imaginative. It's so different. And they're different, but they seem at the same time, there's certain parallels that you can see in their writing. But
Oh yeah, definitely.
yeah, yeah. But it made me excited. It felt like opening up this other door, this other part of fantasy, this other era of fantasy that I
Because
hadn't quite known about before, or heard talked about enough before.
the more obscure, unfortunately, people like Tanith Lee and Sherry Tepper was somebody I really like reading as well. And it was whatever, well, back when I was reading, fantasy was in the early 90s. There was no internet. So it was whatever was in the library or whatever was in the bookshops. And it was hard to find sometimes more obscure authors that existed at the time, like Louise Bujold. I never saw her books.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't. I only learned about her much later when the internet came along.
We need to talk
But
about Lois Bajol too here in a minute, but go ahead.
yeah, I haven't read her, but I want to read her. But that's the thing, you're limited by what's available. And what was available at the time was mainly the very popular fantasy. But every now and again, you'd find some obscure book somewhere. Like, I have got a Tanith Lee book. I honestly cannot remember it because it's been that long since I've read it. It's got to be at least 30 years. But it's always interesting finding the less well known authors who really deserve a lot more popularity than they have. I know there are some Australian authors that nobody knows. Sarah Douglas is one of my favorite fantasy authors, but I never see her talked about on YouTube. And she has written several series. So there's always these surprises that you stumble across and you feel like you found this treasure because no one else knows about it, or it seems very few people know about it. It's different now with the internet because you will find something somewhere based on an author, but I love that you are enjoying older fantasy
I do
because I
love
don't.
older fantasy. Yeah,
Yeah,
I do.
yeah.
I like I said, I'm not as well read in it as you all. I want to say hi to Brian really quickly from BellTube, and I wanted to. This is a good timing to bring him up because you had mentioned earlier, Kathy, that you're a huge urban fantasy fan these days.
Mm,
Brian just did a fantastic video that I recommend everybody go check out that is about urban fantasy magic. And he talks about the best magic in urban fantasy. Of course, he brings up the Dresden Files, spoiler alert there, but he also brings up a lot of other urban fantasy
I'll
that I had
hear it.
never heard of. And so, if you want some
Yeah,
really good urban fantasy recommendations, highly recommend checking out Brian's video there. But back to what you were saying, yeah, it, to me, and this also speaks to something I wanted to ask you too about too, and maybe I'll pivot to Joseph too because I want to hear first like your tentatively thoughts because I know you had a great experience as well with what you read, and also just your experience with older fantasy because like I feel like I don't know if it's me. I don't imagine it's just me, but I feel like the quality of the writing itself feels different to me than a lot of fantasy that I've read within the last 10 years that's published in the last 10 years. And there's good things. There are things I really love about the trends and ways that fantasy is going right now. Like, for example, I do love that we have a lot more diversity in fantasy. I think that's a plus for me. And just a lot of different
or women.
types of fantasy in general. Yes, and women in the character work, a lot of things that go deeper maybe into some social aspects that or different social aspects, I should say, than were approached back in the day. But I really do feel like there's something a little more evocative for me about the prose when it comes to backlisted fantasy and just
Yeah.
something more about the whimsical nature of the writing and the imagination, the wild imagination that's evoked when I read a Moorcock book or when I think about Jack Vance's writing or Kenneth Lee's writing. There's just something a little different. So I wonder if that's your experience too, Joseph, and if you have any thoughts about Kenneth Lee or backlisted fantasy in general.
Yeah, when it comes to Tanith Lee, like I that book was such a refreshing read. It's just so beautiful and lyrical in a way that I rarely see in newer books, even books a decade after that one was written. She just does such an amazing job, and her influences when it comes to that, because she takes a lot of folklore from like in and around England and kind of puts that in there, and it's just so amazing. And when it comes to older fantasy, that was a major catalyst for me even making a channel, is because I'd read so many books that I saw no one talking about on BookTube, and I wanted to get them out there. And I started a project in 2023 where I was reading Appendix N, which is the list of the books in the back of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition that Gary Gygax said influenced the creation of D&D, and it's
Mm,
almost a list of just good fantasy and science fiction to read from about 1930 to 1977 when the book came out. And so
mm,
I wanted to build a foundation for my reading of like newer fantasy by seeing kind of where it came from, and I used that as like a guide, and it was super rewarding. And Tanith Lee is on there, and a lot of
mm.
the other stuff that I reviewed, especially early in my channel, are on there. That's how I found Roger Zelazny, who is now one of my favorite writers of all time, and so it's been really
Blasny
fun.
is amazing. Yes. Oh man, we should. Yeah, I should have brought him up too. What imagination! What incredible imagery in his writing. Yeah.
I
Sorry, I
haven't
didn't mean to
read
interrupt.
Selazny. Here's
Oh,
one I haven't read, but I've got him on my bookshelf because, like I said, it was what was available at the time. And a lot of these authors that are very well respected, you just never saw them in the bookshops or in the library. But I'm also trying to catch up on some of those authors that I did miss out in the 90s. So he's definitely one I want to read.
yeah. Oh, same here. I feel like there's so many authors, and I need to read more Zelazny in general. I've only read Lord of Light, to be honest, but it was one of my favorite books of the year a couple of years ago.
Mm,
And but I was so impressed with his prose and his wit, and
I
it was
do.
just so creative. It was so different. Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I agree with you that I think the writing was different, say 30 years ago, 40 years ago, or more, because less fantasy was actually getting published. There is a lot more fantasy today. So you have a variety of styles. But back then, you had to be really good to get published because they just
Mm.
didn't publish as much fantasy. So, of course, they had to write differently or very well compared to, and that's not being a slight. I'm not trying to slight any of the authors today, but I think there was the standard expected back then is different to what we expect today. And I think there's room for all styles of writing, but there is also a lot more fantasy than there was back then. Back then, you would have maybe half a bookshelf in a bookshop selling fantasy. Today, it's rows and rows of it, which means there is a lot more of it. So you will have disparity in quality, I think, at times. But it may also be a trend. Back then, you had to write in a certain style if you wished to get published. You had to write epic fantasy in Tolkien like if you wanted to get your books published. So I think there's a lot of factors that go into why the writing was different then and the kind of stories you got back then compared to now. But in every now and again, you find someone like you said, Tanith Lee, and or I find somebody like Sarah Douglas who surprised me. I didn't expect to love her work, but I do. Or Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman were very popular back then. I love their books. Not all of them, but especially their Deathgate cycle. And it seems that today I just don't find as much fantasy that appeals to me as much. And that may be because the writing isn't quite the same as the older style. And then I find somebody like Stephen Erickson. So you just have to hunt
You have to
a little
hunt.
bit more.
I agree
Yeah.
with you. One thing I wanted to add though to what Joseph was saying about Tanith Lee is I think she said in the forward of Knight's Master, if I'm not I'm trying to remember exactly what she said, but it sounded like she was largely self-taught when it came to writing. And one of the things that blows my mind when I read her writing is like you were saying, Kathy, that it was harder to get published back then. There was a certain standard that you had to meet. But one thing that blows my mind about her writing is the way that she uses metaphor and the way she uses her prose in such a and it's so beautiful, it's so ethereal, and I read one book there's one book I read a couple of years ago that was getting a lot of praise for the writing being like that, to be more whimsical and more fairy tale-like and more ethereal, and when I read that book, it's a modern book, and I was like, I read it and then I read Kenneth Lee. I'm like, they don't even compare. Like Kenneth
Mm,
Lee had such a gift for writing in that style in a way that feels authentic. It doesn't feel contrived. Whereas like I read a modern book that was trying to go for something like that, even though they were very different stories. And I felt like it just felt so contrived. It felt so forced. And
mm,
that was the thing about Kenneth Lee is she wrote that way, but it didn't feel forced. And also just to Evie's point here about the economy of language, I do agree with that, and at the same time, I would admit, and this is why I think a lot of older fantasy could be less appealing to more modern fantasy, is that while there is I would say that there is a lot more descriptive detail in a lot of the older fantasy that I gravitate towards, like, when I think about Vance's prose or Zelazny's prose or Tanith Lee's prose, there's a lot more imaginative world building concepts and descriptions and aspects of like proximity and setting, but it does come as at a sacrifice. And the sacrifice in my limited experience is mostly to like, for example, in Vance's case, the plot. Like there's no build up to things happening. You just kind of like are there, oh, I'm gonna do this, and the next thing you know, you're there doing the thing. Or it's also at a sacrifice to going really in depth into a character's in-depth psychological exploration, like you're not getting that Hobb exploration of, like, Fitz's character, for example, to the same level maybe. So there are certain sacrifices I think that are made based on things that a lot of modern fantasy readers look for is my guess, but at the same time, I do agree that in some ways, the storytelling itself could be economical, but the imaginative world building and setting, I don't feel like that's sacrificed at all, which is really cool. And no, I haven't
mm,
read Earthsea yet, and I'm sorry. But I am reading Le Guin. I'm currently reading The Left Hand of Darkness, actually, right now, and I am gonna get to Earthsea, I hope, this year.
mm,
Any responses you wanna say?
I think when you're talking about modern stuff trying to do the same thing the older stuff did, I think the best example, and Evie will be happy to hear this, is The Spear Cuts Through Water. I think that is probably the closest you get a modern fantasy novel to stuff like Tanith Lee or Roger Zelazny in their prose
mm,
and just the
mm,
structure of the story. I think, I mean, of course, he pushes it to another level with the three different styles of POV, but definitely at like a sentence by sentence level, I see a lot of older fantasy in The Spear Cuts Through Water.
Oh, that is such a good observation. I hadn't thought about that comparison before, but I have said, even though Spirit Cuts Through Water, it wasn't a personal favorite for me, but at the same time, I think the book is so objectively good, like beyond my personal enjoyment, that I feel like I feel like Jimenez's writing, his skill in writing, is some of the best I've come across in recent modern fantasy. I think it's one of the best.
mm.
Yeah.
Well, Evie has sold it to so many people that I also want to try it just to see what I think of it. Because
Yeah.
especially if it is similar in style to some of the older fantasy, it might appeal to me.
I
And
think
that's not
so.
to say that you can't enjoy more modern fantasy, but there is also room for some of the older style of writing. And yet it seems, unfortunately, we tend to focus a lot more on what is out today and what is new rather than some of the older fantasy that's been around and deserves a bit more praise than it gets. I
Yeah.
like reading a mixture. I like reading a modern fantasy as well as rereading or reading an older fantasy. And it's interesting to make that comparison between the two. The styles of writing, in particular, the storytelling is different. Sometimes it is more, well, it seems, well, no, I'm going to be generalizing, so I'm not going to say that.
Oh, it's
But
okay.
the truth is,
No, we can
well,
understand. Yeah.
yeah, I just think that it's too easy to generalize and say that most fantasy, modern day fantasy, is lacking in something or seems to concentrate on something. But there's just so much of it today and such a broad variety that I don't think you can really easily generalize about it. There are some modern writers who have beautiful prose, for example. There are some who are masters at plot. So I just don't want to generalize and say, well, we only get this in modern fantasy. I think it's an evolving genre, like all genres, and it is also influenced by societal changes. So you see that in fantasy. I think sometimes people forget that a book that was written 40 years ago will read differently for someone today, whereas at the time it would have been acceptable. Certain things would have been more acceptable than they are now. And I would like to see more people be aware of that you can't judge a book by today's standards. You really have to consider the time that the books were written, whenever
Yeah.
it was, even
Oh,
if you don't agree with what they say. Yeah.
absolutely agreed with that. Absolutely agreed with that. And speaking of authors, like you mentioned, Stephen Erickson, he's in an interesting place because he does write in such a amazing way. Very different than a lot of what we see in very recent modern fantasy, but he's still writing.
Mm.
He's still writing. And
Yeah, yeah,
speaking of another couple of authors who are still writing from this time, we have to bring up, of course, Jenny Words and
yeah,
by the way, speaking of
yeah.
Janny Words, I thought it'd be fun to bring her up here because she actually recommended this book to me too, The Rogue. She recommended to me Ian M. Banks' The Player of Games. So maybe I'll have to get to that. I think that's part of the Culture series, if I'm not
I was
mistaken.
going
It
to
is.
ask,
It's
is that
so
the Culture
good.
series?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the
Which
second
book is
book.
it? Is it like second or third or
Yeah,
something?
it's the second, but you can start with
Okay.
it because the first one, Consider Phlebas, was it doesn't feel like any of the other culture books that I've read so far. It's very
Hmm.
different. A lot of them take place a lot of them start in the culture, like the society, and then it works out, but that one is Consider Phlebas is from an outsider's POV, and it's got a strange structure and pacing to it, and I think the Player of
Hmm.
Games is the best place to start because it's not like a concurrent story, so you can hop around, and especially with the early
Ah,
books.
I didn't know
So
that.
so the Player
I
of
have the
Games is the
first
best
three
place.
books. I have the first three books because I wanted to try him. I want to try a lot of different authors, so I'd buy the books, but I would have just started. I always start by publication date, and that's something I wanted to ask. Do you prefer to read based on the ones that people recommend, or do you read by publication date? Because I have very strong feelings on, for myself, I mean, not for others, that I want to see the progression in the author's writing. So I always start with publication date. Even when I'm told don't read the first book, I'll read it anyway because I want to see how it will change.
I think when it comes to that, it really just depends because if it's an author known for standalones, I'll jump in wherever someone suggests, and if I like them, then I'll go back to the beginning. I mean, like
Mm.
when it came to Glenn Cook, I only knew about the Black Company, and that was the middle of his career. So I then, and even when I read them all, I didn't read them in like publication order. I just hopped around all year, and other people like Zelazny, with him, I just read what people recommended, which was Lord of Light, and then I read the first five in his
The Amber,
what is that? Yeah, Amber
Amber.
series, and then also I just jumped around there too. I think I started with Lord of Light, then I read This Immortal because it tied with Dune for the Hugo Award when
Mm,
Wow.
in 1966, and so I was like, oh, I got to give this a try. And so I
mm.
depend. It really depends on the author because some authors you have to start at the beginning because it's one big series. You can't just read Robert Jordan and be like, I'm going to start with Knife of Dreams, book 11 or whatever.
I wonder if
Yes,
it's a
no, I agree with that. You can't do that. But that's a continuous series. But for example, the Discworld books, I started them 3 years ago, and everyone said, no, you need to start with Guards, or you should start with The Witches and don't read the first two books. And I think Mike from Mike's Book Reviews decided to read by publication order, and he didn't like the first book. But I actually did. And I had no problems continuing with the series. And looking back, of course, you may say, no, it's not one of my favorites. But I loved seeing how Pratchett went from the first book to how he created this world, added to it, and how his writing improved and how he honed his skill with all the witticisms, and I am really enjoying reading them by publication order. But I think you're right. With certain authors, especially if it's not a series, you can read a standalone and then go back and decide, okay, I'm going to read this series. But with a series or one series, I like to start from the beginning, no matter what people tell me. Yeah.
I
What about you,
started
Joanna?
Discworld. I,
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
I'm not the most dug in about where I start for the most part. Like, I mean, if it's a series, maybe, but I'm not the most dug in because I'm not immediately dedicated to an author. You know what I mean? Like,
Mm, yeah.
so I mean, I guess it just depends. But if I'm taste testing an author, I do like to read a standalone just to get a taste test.
Yeah.
That's usually where I like to start. And then from there, I don't I wanna make sure I'm taste testing something that's maybe not the best of the best, but something that's good enough to know that this is gonna be an author for me. So, like, for example, I read The Lions of Alrasan as my first Guy Gavriel Kay book because that's what Jake Bishop recommended. It's not Kay's first book, but it gives you enough of a taste of, like, what he's brilliant at as an author. Some people do consider that his favorite book, his best book. But, I'm glad I started there. I think
Mm,
it made me know enough to know that I'm gonna continue reading from Guy Gavriel Kay. So I guess it just really kinda depends. Yeah. I'm not dug in
mm.
about publication order though, no.
I read
Good.
the Discworld series in publication order, and like I've only read, I think I'm up to Guards, but I've read the first six 3 times. I started at the beginning, and and later on I found out that you weren't supposed to start at the beginning, and people are like, those aren't the good ones, and I'm like, if these aren't the good ones, how good are the good ones? Because I love that series,
Just you
especially.
wait, Joseph.
Yeah, I
They
know.
get
I'm looking
better.
forward to it.
Seriously, they get better. I mean, I love the first ones as well. But yeah, there is no doubt that as Pratchett wrote more and more books, they really did get better. I just read Night Watch. I just finished it actually in the Guards. And I loved it. It was
I hear
so
a lot of
good.
people say that's their favorite.
Yeah, I can understand why. I don't It's really hard to choose with a long series like this that is 41 books. I've only read 33 so far, but I can't make I can't decide on one. I usually have like five favorites, but that one I think is going to be up there. Yeah.
That's amazing. Yeah, I've only read Guards, and Men at Arms. Like, that's all I've read so far, and I'm so overdue to read the 3rd one. I actually have it on my TBR for this year, and I'm supposed to be buddy reading that with Murphy at some point, but need to touch base with her. I'm not sure exactly when, but I do wanna continue the Night City Watch books.
See
Yeah.
to watch. Yeah.
I
They're
will
worth reading. Discworld is worth reading. Yeah.
I
What
will
did you say?
say with the early Discworld novels, they are incredibly rewarding if you have read older fantasy because he has so many
Mhm.
characters in there that are characters from other stuff. Like, of course, there's the one that everyone knows, which is like basically Old Man Conan the Barbarian, but There's Fawford and the Grey Mouser in the
Yeah.
first book. Like he has his own version of them, and it is hilarious. And he does such a good job of like making these little Easter eggs throughout the first few books to the fantasy he basically grew up reading. It's really fun.
Yeah.
I read them when I read them for the third time, the first two books in Discworld. It was after I had read all of Appendix N, and it blew me away how good Pratchett was at showing his knowledge of the genre in those
Mm.
books.
Wow. And that's amazing, especially as somebody who loves the older backlisted fantasy. So, wow, maybe I'll wait till I read a little bit more. Like, I haven't read, for example, gosh, I forgot the second story you mentioned. The Gray Mouse. What is it?
Oh, Fawford and the Grey Mouser from Fritz Leiber, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, Fitzleiber. I have not read any Fitzleiber. I know Tori did not
I
like
haven't
that
read
book,
it.
but
Yes.
The
but go ahead.
the biggest problem with Fawford and the Grey Mouser, especially the first one, Swords and Deviltry, is the first two stories he wrote later, and they're not very good, and they're kind of like the origins of the two characters. The only story in that worth reading, because initially they were short stories that were just published by themselves, is Ilmet and Longmar. I mean, that one's won awards, and it is perfect. It shows just everything
Mm.
Fritz Leiber is good at. It's funny. There's good action. You get to really understand who the characters are, and their origin stories in that book don't do them justice. Like they're not fun. I can't stand them. I love Fawford and the Grey Mouser, but yeah, the first two in there basically unsell people from reading them. So
Oh,
I would
Mm.
recommend starting with Ilmet and Longmar as like a by itself, and then you can either go back or you can just move forward because those two origin stories just aren't fun at all.
see, this is
I
why
haven't read.
I don't. This is why I'm not dug in on publication order for myself, I guess. Because hearing that, I'm like, okay, I want to make sure I go about it this the right way. And I know, yeah, yeah, and also the Rogue. I definitely agree that that's not not the best starting place for Guy Gabriel Kay, and everybody always usually starts with Tigana, but
That's what
yeah.
I've heard, that he yeah, a lot of people don't seem to like Tigana.
I
I
love
have not read.
Tigana, but I didn't I
Oh, okay.
it's not my favorite by far, no.
Mm.
It's not my
Yeah,
it
I'm
certainly has
determined to
problems.
read one.
Yeah, it certainly has some so I with Tigana, I feel like it's there are certain things about the book that for me, I love that I think Kay does brilliantly, but there are certain things that I really don't like about that book. Um, yeah, so it's hard. I do not recommend that for your first K though. Yeah.
No, I've got a song for Arbon. I've had it for 30 years and it's time I read it, and I'm hoping to read it next month. So, because this one's a bit jam packed, but yeah, I'm just, especially with everyone on Fireside who sings Kay's praises, I feel like I've got to read at least one and see what I think. But yeah, that one is definitely on my list for next month.
I'm a little
Hmm.
partial to it because of my background with knowing about the history of troubadours and everything, but I love that
I
book.
love troubadours. Yeah.
And I love
Uh,
songs in books. So
mm.
that's the other thing
So
too.
do I.
Okay,
We had
good.
a debate about that in, I think it was the Dragon Bone Chair, when we were discussing it in the thread on the book. There was a few people saying they hated music or songs in books. And I thought, but I love the music and the songs in books because it tells a story, because that was a form of storytelling in the past. So yeah, it was interesting how some people don't really like seeing songs in a book, as in a made up song that the author has written rather than a known one. But I think it's not for everyone.
It depends,
Mm,
you know, I think it depends on the quality of the songs personally, but I think Kay writes beautiful poetry. And I feel
mm,
like the other thing is that the songs in that book, in A Song for a Bone, specifically affect the character motivations and the plot of the
mm.
story overall in a very specific way. And I don't think that that's always the case. Sometimes people I can see the case for why people think some songs are a little bit more just like world building fluff, so to speak. Not to say that I necessarily feel that way, but in that book, it's important. It's integral to the story.
Yeah. I think good, or the good songs in books should seamlessly be part of the story and actually advance the story, whether it's about the characters or the plot or give you some history of this world. But I actually do enjoy them, so I'm looking forward to reading it. Have you read any, Joseph? Have you read any
Yes.
Guy Gabriel Kay? You have? Who?
A Song for Our Bond was the first one I
Oh,
read, and I loved it. I did it on
mm,
audio, and the narrator is fantastic, and that man can
mm,
sing. So
Yes.
he does such a good job with the songs. And
mm.
the other ones I've read were I did Sailing to Sarantium and Lord of Emperors after that, the Sarantine Mosaic,
Okay.
because it ticked every box for me. It not only is it Kay, who I found out I loved after A Song for Our Bond, but it's based on the Byzantine Empire, and it just
Mm,
I can picture all of it in my head because I've been so obsessed with that time in history, and I adored it. And then I read The Lions of Alrasan. So those are all I've read, and The Lions of Alrasan is my favorite.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I love that's my second favorite. The Starry Mosaic is my least favorite case so far. I was not as a female, mostly because of the way the female characters were used in the book. But I mean, it still does a lot of things brilliantly. Like I still think they're good. But yeah, I'm excited to hear your K thoughts, Kathy. But we have to talk about
mm,
Bujold as well. Now, I know,
mm.
Kathy, you've not yet read Bujold, but Joseph,
No.
everyone, please, if you're not subscribed to Joseph and Kathy, of course, subscribe to them. Their channels are linked in the description. I'll say that again when we close. But Joseph did a fantastic, fantastic, and helpful, much needed overview of Bujold's books in a recent
Mm,
video. And I say
okay.
needed because Bujold is a very prolific author. She's still writing, and it is so confusing knowing where to start with her books. Maybe,
Mm,
yeah, it's very confusing to me because if you look up her books, especially on Goodreads, the way they order things, it's confusing. I feel like Joseph, your overview was much needed and appreciated. And I have been loving this author. I picked up the Penrick novella, Penrick's Demon, the first book in the Penrick novella series in January. And really, I knew this was an author for me right away. I loved her humor. I loved her writing. And then I read Curse of Chalion last month and thought it was brilliant. But yeah, tell us about Bujold. I know this is your main
mm.
reading project on your channel right now. Tell us how you found out about Bujold and what you love about her.
So I had heard about her for years now, just seeing her name pop up when people talked about favorite
Yeah.
writers. And then I finally gave her a chance because of Jake, because he was talking about uh, the Vorkosigan saga. So I gave Shards of Honor a try, just as dip my toe in, and I loved it. And after that, I knew I was going to read everything she had written, and I just wasn't sure when I was going to do it. And I started in January, just started with Penrick and Desdemona because they're little novellas and they seemed fun. And by the end of the month, I knew that her bibliography was going to be my project for this year, and I'm going
Mm,
to read everything. And her her writing is just so good. Not only is she good at blending other genres, at least so far, I just I just can't get over how fun her books are, which is weird to say
mm,
because sometimes you would think that reading itself would be fun, but her books are just a joy to read. And I know that she has a very wide range in her style, and so I knew that would also kind of keep me entertained through the year of reading everything she's written. And I just can't get over just every little thing she does is just perfect. It's so hard to critique the book. Sometimes it's usually like pacing is like the only thing, and it's like maybe that's just me or how I felt at the time. But I don't understand how she's just so good at hitting the mark every single time.
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
many of her books have you read so far?
I have read the first 7 or 8 Penrick and Desdemona novellas, and I've read Shards of Honor, and that's it so far.
Yeah,
Mm,
and she's very popular too. I know when I've talked about her in
mm,
videos, I've had a lot of people in the comment section just rave about how much they love Bujold's writing, how much they
mm,
enjoy her. And yeah, Matthew here says Bujold is masterful, not showy and flowery, just buttery smooth prose, smart, funny, humane, wonderful. Yes. And I have to
Yes.
say too,
mm.
I am not
Yeah.
somebody who picks up books based on humor, and I'm very particular about humor in books. I do love, like, Abercrombie's humor, I like Erickson's humor sometimes, and, I don't know, sometimes humor doesn't quite land with me too, but with Joel's humor is it's not a
Works
humor
for me.
that necessarily makes me laugh out loud kind of funny, but I it makes me smile and kinda chuckle inwardly, and it's delightful. I love the way she does that, and she also has an incredible ability to have that lightness and that delightful little humor that sparkles her story, and still have some grit to her story,
Hmm.
and have some really good in-depth character work and
Well,
development.
I'm sold. I'm sold. I'm going
Yes.
to read it. I think a lot of people have heard of The Curse of Chalion, so I might start there. But yeah, I'm definitely going to try her.
That
I've
was
wanted to
brilliant.
actually for a long time. I just could never find her books. But now, of course, it's much easier to get books because you can buy them online. But
Yeah.
yeah, she sounds really good writer actually. Are you reading you're reading the Penrick, is it Penrick
Yeah,
stories?
Penrick and
Yeah.
Desdemona novellas. That's what I'm starting with, and then I'm just gonna do all of the World of the Five Gods before I move on. And so that's the Penrick and Desdemona stuff, which kind of takes place in the middle of like the timeline. But she has said you don't have to read any of them in order, and
Mm,
other
mm,
than Curse of Chalion and Paladin of Souls, because she said I think Paladin of Souls takes place right after Curse of Chalion, so it makes sense
yeah.
to read it right after. So I'm gonna do all the Penrick and Desdemona novels, which my wife and I have been buddy reading, and it's been a ton of fun. And
Oh,
then
that's
I'm gonna
fantastic.
yeah,
Yeah.
and then I'm gonna do Curse of Chalion, and then Paladin of Souls, and then the where is it? I got it on my shelf. I gotta find the Hollowed Hunt. Is that what it's called?
Yes, that's right. Mhm.
Yeah, that one takes place before all of them, but usually people
Mm.
recommend reading it later. So I'll hop back to that, and then I don't know where I'm gonna go after that with her stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, she did say in the back of the Penrick novella, that ebook that I read, that you can read the Chalian books as standalones. Like, they were written as standalones, but they do make sense in publication order. Like, because, like you said, the second book, Paladin of Souls, does follow a character, I believe, that's written in the first book, and
Mm.
it does take place afterwards. Yeah, it is strange the way that she wrote this novels, like the timeline of the novels, but I
Mm.
think you would love her, Kathy, and the Penrick
Mm.
novellas, I've only read the first one, I've heard they get better and better, is that
They
correct,
do.
Joseph?
Everyone is better. Like Penrick, the second one, Penrick Shaman, is a huge upgrade if that's even possible from Penrick's Demon, and then it just goes from there. I think the only one I found a little weak was it's Masquerade and Lodi. I think is the one, and it's just fine, but it's also one of the shortest ones, so it doesn't take very long to get there
Mm.
if you're not having a good time. But it's fun, and it's still very well written. I just think when everything else is immaculate, the flaws kind of shine in one that's just a little worse than the others.
Yeah.
But
Mm.
she has a chunk of them in the middle that I just finished, and they all take place in the same area.
Mhm.
I think the easiest way to look at these are they're episodic. There's not an overall theme to them. It's kind of like coming into a TV show where each episode is just a different story, and
Mm.
they're so good. They're so fun, and they're such a refreshing read because we're talking about grimdark and dystopia and nihilism earlier. This is the antithesis of that.
Yeah.
It just makes you feel good about humanity and just being alive and everything. They're just so fun.
Yeah, and it's funny in a way that it is almost delightful fantasy because it's like demonic possession.
Yeah.
But that's almost part of it too. That's also part of its charm, is that we are kinda having this
Mm.
dark backdrop, and it is the same world as Curse of Chalion. Somebody had written that
Mm.
too. Yeah, so the Penricks, I think they take place, I wanna say many, many years before, like
Like
hundreds of
a
years
hundred years.
before.
Yeah.
Yeah, before the Chalian books, and it's I know, Joseph, you haven't yet read Curse of Chalion, but it's really interesting to contrast her writing of Curse of Chalion, which almost feels kinda epic and almost like a traditional fantasy story, and yet it feels like it has a little bit more, I would say, I don't wanna say substance, but yeah, it does feel a little bit more substantive than the Penrick novellas, but at the same time, it makes me more excited to read more of her books, just
Mhm.
understanding her range. And I still haven't read Shards of Honor yet, but I do want to read her sci-fi at some point too.
The Rogue asked, so it's a form of cozy fantasy. Penric and Desdemona, yes, it's
Yeah.
very cozy. I think it has a little higher stakes than you would expect from most cozy fantasy, but it definitely has those vibes. Like the second one, Penric Shaman, what I like about it is it's almost like a buddy cop thing going on in there where they're
Mhm.
trying to find someone, and it's so fun. But yeah, like they said, but Penric's defining trait is his kindness. It's just it's so cool to have a main character that you just love because they're such a good person, such a decent person.
I agree. He was so endearing right away. Yeah.
I do like a hero figure. I know some people are drawn to darker, more tormented souls, but I also do like a heroic figure
You
in
would
fantasy.
love Kazaril in Curse of Chalion.
Mm,
I predict. I
mm,
predict you will love that character.
mm. I'm
Yeah.
definitely going to read it. It's just when I can fit it
I
into the
know. Yeah.
TBR.
It's
Yeah.
the curse of booktube.
Mm,
But I do I guess I do honestly feel more drawn to older books, like to backlisted fantasy. Like I said, I'm not as well read as you two are when it comes to the genre in the backlisted stuff, but like I light up a little bit more towards that kind of stuff. I don't know actually. How old is now that I think about it, how old are the Penric books? When was that published?
They're new. I think
Are they new?
I think they've been written in the last 25 years. I think the last few were written in just the last 4 years.
Ah,
I know
yeah.
her Shards of Honor or her Verkosigan series started in I think '86 was when Shards of Honor
Mhm.
was published. So she's been writing for a long time.
What a gifted writer, because she
I
writes
know.
in such a way that it feels like it could have been written. I don't know how to explain it. Like, she has the elements I love in books written in the 90s, and at the same time, there's a lot that I think modern fantasy readers would love too. Like, I actually felt like, and I've said this in my video, I feel like people who love Curse of Chalion, or people who love Guy Gavriel Kay, I should put it this way, should read Curse of Chalion. I feel like
mhm.
they evoke
Similar.
something similar. Yeah,
I
a
see a
similar
lot of
kind of
elements of Kay in her writing in the
thing.
Penric and Desdemona stuff. Just in the way, I think a lot of it is the kind of the relationships between people. I see a lot of Kay's style and just kind of the way she conveys like the character's emotions. It reminds me a lot of some of the stuff I've read in Kay.
Definitely. I definitely feel like those are 2 authors that need to be talked about side by side. I agree. Oh, it makes me so happy. Joseph, I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you inspired me to pick up the Penric novella series. So, I
Mm.
didn't even expect to pick up a new fantasy series this year, but I'm gonna be continuing that series
Oh,
thanks to
good. I'm
you.
glad. Then
Yes.
making the video is worth it.
Yeah, it's a great video too. It really is an excellent video.
I
So,
love the deep dive videos that you do.
Oh,
It's
thank you.
just that sometimes I wait before I'm ready because then I'll get too excited and I want to read it and I'm not ready to read it. So I wait until I'm actually looking for something to read and then I think, yeah, I'll go and watch Joseph's video. But I do love your deep dives. I think they're fantastic.
yeah,
I
I
have
kinda lucked out because I watched Joseph's video where he talked about the Desdemona series and their novellas. So I was like, "Novella? Taste test
Mm.
of an author I've been curious about." And my library, my Libby app, happened to have both the ebook and the audiobook, so I
Ah,
kinda lucked out there. I think they have more of the
yeah,
series too, so I'll be checking them out through the library. But yeah, I'm
fantastic.
so stoked about reading more
Mm.
Bejeweled, and yeah, it's wonderful. I wanna ask you both because I know the answer for you, Kathy. Joseph, have you read any Jenny Wirtz?
no, I have not. I have. So I got lucky. I found three first edition first printings of I think the middle trilogy in hardcover just at a random bookstore in Iowa of all places, and I also
Mm.
have To Ride Hell's Chasm. So I have all three of those. I think I was going to start with To Ride Hell's Chasm just because I need a low barrier to entry to get into an author that has written a series that long.
No, read To Ride Hell's Chasm. That's definitely the recommendation,
Okay.
100%. I love that book. I love that book.
I haven't read To Ride Hell's Chasm, but I did read her previous trilogy before, and some standalone she had, like I think Stormwarden is a standalone. I found that the writing was a little different in the Wars of Light and Shadow from the previous book. So, but I can't speak to Ride Hell's Chasm. But just be aware they may not be the same writing style. I think
No,
it does change.
yeah, she has talked about that with the trilogy, I guess, to be clear, she does have a couple of trilogies. One is the one she wrote with Raymond E. Feist with the Daughter of
Yes, the
Vampire,
Empire. Yeah.
and then there's another trilogy she wrote, I can't remember the name of, that's a little
I've got
bit.
them. I've read them, but I
Oh,
can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. Yes.
yeah, that one is a lot more, and she's talked about this, like, she's written a lot of books that are a lot more accessible in writing style, like, I think
Mm,
that those are supposed to be more accessible. To Ride Hell's Chasm is closer in style to the Wars of Light
okay.
and Shadow,
Okay.
but it's not
Mm,
quite as dense. I feel like Wars of Light and Shadow is still a step above to Ride Hell's Chasm, but I don't think you'll have any problem at all, Joseph, just because 'cause you're so used
no.
to reading a lot of denser fantasy and prose styles. The one thing that I would say that sticks out the most to me about Wertz's prose, there are a couple things, but one thing that sticks out the most just on a sentence structure level is that she tends to enjoy writing sentences that have a long introductory phrase, and then before you get to the active part of the sentence, like the subject verb. So her sentence structures are they're active voice. They'll say like she realized, he did, this that. But before you get to she did, he realized, he blah blah blah. Before you get to that direct part of the sentence, you have this long with a blah 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 and a blah 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 and a blah 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 blah. He did this. So you have this long-winded thing of where you're being described something before you know what you're talking about. So I feel like that's a pattern I've noticed over and over and over again in her books, and it slows you down. Even Gardner talks about this actually in his book on writing, that the long introductory phrase is something that will slow the reader down. And Wertz has
Mm,
said many times that she wrote in a way intentionally to make the reader slow down. But that is something, a pattern that I've noticed, that one way in which she does that. But that said, I have to say, like, she has probably the best diction of any writer I've ever read, meaning that her word choice couldn't be more perfect in situations. Even books, even words I have to look up sometimes. I'm like, "What? What is that word?" And I look it up, I'm like, "That couldn't be more perfect for what she's describing." And also, I think her nature descriptions are unparalleled. I think the
yeah.
nature descriptions in the series are beautiful.
Well, she writes beautifully at times.
Mhm.
There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
But it is different. Just be aware, earlier books. But I haven't read To Ride Hell's Chasm. I don't know why. I had read everything else that she had before that. So that one I didn't get for
That was
some
my
reason.
that was my first Words book, and I loved it. I did have a hard time getting into the prose. I did find it was a challenge for me for the first 90 pages or so. I wasn't sure it was gonna be for me, and then after the 90-page mark, something like, clicked in my brain. I can't
Mhm.
explain it. Something with Wertz's prose, it feels like sometimes it just has to click in my brain the right way.
It takes some work.
It
Takes
does.
some work
It
to get
does.
used to.
But
Yeah.
once it clicked, that story at that point on completely flowed for me, and
Mm,
I personally loved it. I loved it. It's like a very simple premise of, like, the princess is missing, and there are these 2 men from different backgrounds who have to team up and figure out how to find her. So it's a bit of
mm.
a mystery, but it's beautiful. I thought it was beautifully written.
I'm looking forward to it. I hopefully can get to it this year. I picked up a yet again. I just lucked out. I forgot where I was, but I found a first edition, first printing of To Ride Hell's Chasm, and I was like, well, I guess this should be a good place to start.
Mhm.
Yeah, that, like I said, that was my first one. Stop making me wanna
Mhm.
read Curse of Talion. I'm already I love Perdido Street Station, by the way, and Bone Clocks. Those are 2 excellent books. Sorry, just had
Mhm.
to add that in. Yeah. Oh, I would love to hear what you 2 think, and I know, Kathy, you and I are actually in the same place in the series right now for
Yeah.
Wars of Light and Shadow.
See, I read everything that she wrote, and I started with the Empire series because that was, I think, the first things or close to the first things. So I read the series Wars of Light and Shadow as they were coming out, rereading the first books, when the next book came out. But there was a period where I stopped reading fantasy of about 10 years. And I just reached the point where I just was tired of fantasy. But I've read, I think, seven of the books, perhaps eight. I can never remember. It's been a while. Excuse me. I think it's been at least 15 years since I read the last one. So I can't recall exactly where I finished. It's been so long now, I have to start back from the beginning, I
Oh,
think, just
yeah.
to get back into the story. And I actually want to now reread the series because it's finished and I'd like to know how it ends.
I was there in that conversation on the fireside where you were talking, you were like, "I don't know, the
Mm.
writing was kind of hit or miss for me," and then the next thing I know,
It
like,
is
part
sometimes. I get
yeah,
tired of it at times.
yeah,
There are times where I'm just like, no, it's just too much work and I get frustrated with the writing. And you have to remember I was reading physical books. So those words that you don't know and you could look up, I wasn't going to go and get a dictionary every single
right,
time.
yeah,
And I couldn't always figure out what she was saying. I do sometimes find the writing frustrating. But there's no doubt I love the story. That's why I read 7 of them, but I
yeah,
just haven't finished it yet. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Maybe next year.
yeah,
Yeah.
um, are you looking around for a book, Joseph?
No, my dog is being a butt. Someone outside is minding their own business, and she's taking offense to it. Hey,
And mine's asleep,
I've heard
thankfully.
beautiful things about Daughter of the Forest by
It's
Marilyn.
a beautiful book.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't like the rest in the series, but I loved the first book.
yeah, and the
And
reason I recommend oh, so sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
no, that's right. I was just saying, I think you would really enjoy it.
Mm,
It's a fairy tale, a darker kind of fairy tale retelling, and it has influence of Gaelic or Celtic
hmm.
mythology as well, and it's beautifully told. I think so. She's
Oh,
a New Zealand writer, actually.
oh, interesting. I
Mm.
didn't know. Oh, maybe I did know that. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, that's interesting. I know you had mentioned that there weren't as that there were some really beautiful or well, like wonderful writers in your area or in Australia, I should say specifically. I wondered about that too because I know I follow a channel who Christiane Jones. I don't know if you know who that is, but she lives in
No.
Australia. I think she lives in Melbourne. Or no, maybe
Oh,
it's no,
I
not
think.
Melbourne. She lives in oh gosh, where is it? I can't remember. It's like because I knew somebody who lived there where she was from, where she lives, and I can't remember now. I forget. But she's Australian, and actually, I followed her for many years. I followed her since she used to live in Japan several years ago, before she was really focused on a lot of books and writing on her channel. But she talked about how fantasy isn't really as there isn't a strong fantasy output in Australia as other genres, that it's not there aren't as many well-known fantasy writers, I guess, at this point.
There was at one point, I found quite a few female authors, Australian female authors. And if it was female and it was Australian, I would buy it,
Yeah.
to support your local authors. We also are a much smaller country with a much smaller, and when I say smaller country, smaller population. So, of course, we just don't have as many people who write and it's not always easy to get published. It's different today because you also have self-pub and things like that, but to get traditionally published, it was quite difficult. So there just weren't a lot at that time.
Yeah.
I actually don't know as much about the modern Australian writers. The only one I've read is J. Christoph's Empire of the Damned. I haven't read the second book, Empire of the Vampire, but I kind of figure vampire books kind of fall between horror and fantasy. But yeah, he's the only one I've read recently, I think, though I'm always open to reading more. There is James Islington,
Oh,
who
yeah.
wrote The War of
Mhm.
the Many. He's also Australian. So there are a few, just not a lot. I
That's
have read
interesting.
the Black Magician trilogy by Trudy Canavan. She was very popular. I actually met her and She signed some of my books, but I actually think that Sarah Douglas was a better writer, in my opinion. But Douglas has passed away, so there's only a limited amount of books from her. Whereas Canavan is still writing today, as far as I know.
Ah,
I think I said she's Australian. Yeah.
yeah. By the way, Joseph, beautiful dog.
Oh, thank you.
What
Yeah,
kind of
she's
dog do you have? I missed it. I'm a dog
oh,
lover, so I love seeing them.
come here. Come here. Get up here. She's half
My
Rottweiler, half mutt of some kind. This is
Oh, I
she's
love
she's
Roddies.
she's Evie, named after the
Gorgeous.
Pokemon. She's an old lady. That's all the white on her
Oh,
face.
I
That
could
wasn't
see
there.
that. You're a sweet
Uh,
old lady.
Yeah, she
Oh,
just turned 10.
oh,
that's how my dog looked, but yeah, towards the end. Yeah, beautiful.
Oh,
that
it's a
does
Beautiful
really
remind
face.
me of your dog.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it does, huh? A little bit. It looks a little like my dog, my old dog.
Yeah, this white is because she's so high strung. She likes to stress out over nothing. So, but she's been the best dog. She's the only dog I've had as an adult, and yeah, she's been wonderful.
Oh, Evie is saying I didn't know who name was Evie.
This one, this beautiful old lady.
Oh,
Oh,
she's called Evie, is she? That's
Yeah,
right. You said that. Yes. Yeah, my
Evie.
crazy dog is in the other room. She's sleeping,
oh,
thankfully.
Um, I love it. I love the pets here. Yay.
Yeah, sometimes I think if you're a reader, you're going to have a pet. It seems everyone who reads has pets, whether it's cats or dogs or both.
I
yeah.
laugh every time I'm on Instagram because Gavin, who was here in the chat earlier, he always posts these pictures, and his cat is hilarious. Like always putting her paw on his page, or I just love animal companions when you're reading.
Same. Same. Yeah.
Yeah. Does Evie like to join you when you're reading?
She just likes to sleep. As long as I'm there, she's fine. So
Oh, it's too sweet.
yeah, my cats are the issue, especially my youngest one. He likes to headbutt my books while I'm reading them, and because I mostly read in bed, so I'm laying down with a book over my face, and he'll headbutt it out of my hands into my face because that's his time. He has a ritual where every night he comes in and stands on my chest, and he has to be pet for a certain amount of time, or he won't leave me alone.
Oh, it's so sweet.
It's
I
very
love
safe.
it.
Mm.
Love it.
And you can barely see her, but just above my shoulder right here is my other cat, my void kitty. She's a little
Mm.
tuxedo. She's a rescue we've had since she was 2 weeks old.
Can't
Oh,
quite see because of the dark, but I believe it.
yeah.
Come here, baby.
Cute. Yay. We love the pets here.
Oh,
Oh,
Eden. Yeah, look at her.
I like
Beautiful.
animals.
Yeah.
Oh,
So do I. I also love black cats, but
I have
yeah,
a black
she's
cat too.
gorgeous.
yeah.
He
Gorgeous.
he's 17 or 18 now. Hey, no.
Wow. That's fantastic.
If I wake him up to
Yeah.
show him off, he'll start screaming. So I can't do that.
Yeah, when they're that old, they can do anything they like, as far as I'm concerned.
Evie,
When our animals get old, yeah.
She's
Evie's
the
asked. Go ahead.
she's the 13-year-old cauliflower ear cat. She gave herself cauliflower ears, shaking her head, and the first one happened, and the vet was like, "We can fix it for $1,400, but we can't guarantee it won't happen again." And then she immediately gave herself another cauliflower ear, and so we just have to keep them clean. It doesn't hurt her, or make her uncomfortable. She's actually stopped shaking her head now that they've done it. So
Oh,
Oh. Well, I know I've kept you both for over 2 hours, and I know, Kathy, it's probably a ridiculous time where you are right now.
fine. I'm not going to bed after this. Not
Oh,
yet. I'm just
wow.
a night owl. Yeah. Yeah, that's just me. But I've really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for having me,
oh yeah, thank
having
you.
us both. And it was lovely talking to you as well, Joseph.
Yeah, it was great.
Oh, it's been lovely talking with both of you. And I want to just go ahead and remind everyone to please go ahead and subscribe to these channels if you're not already subscribed, because they are just wonderful channels. I have so much valuable content on BookTube, in my opinion, my humble opinion. I love both of these people. And I just want to thank you all for joining us here in the chat
Thank
and sharing
you.
your thoughts on all the authors that we talked about. We did talk about some really good books and some good authors in this discussion. So thank you all so much for watching, and have
Thank
a
you, everyone.
yeah, thank you. Have a great
Yes.
have a great rest